The first gnome arrived under cover of darkness, a squat, ceramic sentinel with a pointed red hat and a perpetually jovial grin, nestled discreetly amongst Mildred Macmillan's prize-winning petunias. It was a sneaky Sam gnome, specifically chosen for its air of mischievous innocence. He was quickly followed by Grumpy Gus, a gnome whose perpetually furrowed brow seemed to disapprove of Mildred's meticulously manicured lawn, and Happy Hannah, a gnome whose forced cheerfulness felt almost passive-aggressive in its placement beside Mildred's pristine white garden gnome, a lone, solitary figure that now seemed pathetically lonely amidst the sudden influx of ceramic companions. The gnomes, in truth, were not an army. Not yet. They were the vanguard, the reconnaissance unit, a small, silent protest against the tyranny of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and more specifically, against Mildred Macmillan, the self-appointed enforcer of suburban conformity. My name is Arthur Pruitt, and I confess, the gnome army was my creation, my whimsical rebellion against the suffocating sameness that Mildred and the HOA sought to impose upon our little corner of suburbia. It started innocently enough with a single gnome, Fred, a gift from my niece, Lily. Fred stood guard by my mailbox, a cheerful, if slightly weather-beaten, figure welcoming visitors. He was joined by Wilbur, a gnome fishing in my miniature backyard pond, and then Esmeralda, a gnome tending a patch of wildflowers I deliberately let grow a little wilder than HOA regulations strictly allowed. Slowly, organically, the gnome population grew, each gnome with its own personality, its own little story, reflecting my own slightly eccentric, decidedly nonconformist spirit. They were a source of quiet amusement, a whimsical touch in a world that often felt too serious, too regulated. Neighbors smiled, children pointed, and even the mailman chuckled. Everyone, it seemed, appreciated the gnomes, except for Mildred. Mildred Macmillan lived 2 doors down, a woman whose life seemed dedicated to upholding the sanctity of perfectly trimmed hedges and uniformly green lawns. Her own yard was an exercise in sterile perfection, devoid of anything that might be considered remotely whimsical or, dare I say, joyful. She was the president of the HOA, a position she wielded with the iron fist of a suburban dictator. Her reign was one of meticulously enforced rules, passive-aggressive newsletters, and thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly reminders. I chuckled, crumpled the pink paper, and added Professor Gnome, a scholarly gnome with spectacles and a miniature book, to the gnome collective, placing him strategically near the offending friendly reminder as it lay discarded in the recycling bin. I considered it a polite, gnome-themed refusal to comply. Mildred, however, did not appreciate subtlety, or gnomes, or anything that deviated from her rigid vision of suburban perfection. The second friendly reminder arrived a week later, this time printed on a slightly more assertive shade of salmon pink. It was less friendly and more of a demand. It cited the same vague bylaws, but this time included a photograph printed in grainy black and white of my gnomes, circled in red marker, as if they were criminals caught in the act. The tone was now overtly accusatory, bordering on hysterical. Your continued disregard for HOA regulations is unacceptable, it declared. The proliferation of these lawn ornaments is detracting from the overall aesthetic appeal of Willow Creek and creating a nuisance for your neighbors. Nuisance? The only nuisance was Mildred and her pastel pink pronouncements of suburban tyranny. This time, the friendly reminder included a specific ultimatum. Remove all non-approved lawn ornaments within 72 hours or face a fine of $100 per day for each day of non-compliance. $100 per day. For gnomes. The absurdity of it was almost comical if it wasn't so infuriating. It wasn't about aesthetics or property values. It was about control. About Mildred flexing her HOA president muscles, about imposing her will on everyone else. I considered capitulating, briefly, packing away the gnomes, tucking them into boxes, relegating them to the dusty confines of the attic. But the thought of Mildred's smug satisfaction, the image of her surveying my gnomeless lawn with a triumphant smirk, was unbearable. It wasn't just about the gnomes anymore. It was about principle, about resisting petty tyranny, about refusing to let Mildred Macmillan dictate what brought me a little bit of joy in my own backyard. And besides, Lily would be devastated if I got rid of Fred and the others. So I did the only logical thing. I bought more gnomes. Lots more gnomes. I scoured garden centers, online marketplaces, even antique shops, amassing a veritable army of ceramic garden guardians. Gnomes of all shapes and sizes, gnomes fishing, gnomes gardening, gnomes sleeping, gnomes marching, gnomes even holding tiny protest signs, which, admittedly, I crafted myself out of popsicle sticks and felt. The gnome population of my yard exploded, transforming my once ordinary suburban lawn into a whimsical gnome village, a vibrant ceramic counterpoint to Mildred's sterile perfection. It was glorious, defiant, and I knew, utterly infuriating to Mildred. The third friendly reminder was no longer pink. It was a stark, aggressive red, printed in a larger, more menacing font. "Final notice!" it screamed. "Immediate removal of unapproved lawn ornaments required. Failure to comply will result in legal action and further financial penalties." Legal action? Over gnomes? This was escalating rapidly and bordering on the ridiculous. But beneath the absurdity, I sensed a real threat. Mildred was serious. She wasn't just going to send strongly worded letters. She was prepared to escalate this gnome war. That's when the idea struck me. If Mildred wanted a war, I would give her a war. A gnome war. And the battlefield would be her own meticulously manicured lawn. The first wave, Sneaky Sam, Grumpy Gus, and Happy Hannah, were just the beginning. Operation Gnome Invasion was officially underway. The plan was simple, yet audacious: to subtly, gradually, and relentlessly populate Mildred's lawn with gnomes, until her pristine patch of green was completely overrun by my ceramic army. It would be a silent, whimsical invasion, a passive-aggressive act of gnome-based rebellion, and it would, I hoped, drive Mildred Macmillan absolutely mad. The next morning, as the sun rose, casting long shadows across Willow Creek, Mildred Macmillan stepped out onto her perfectly swept porch to retrieve her morning newspaper. She froze. Nestled amongst her prize-winning petunias, grinning inanely at the rising sun, were 3 garden gnomes: Sneaky Sam, Grumpy Gus, and Happy Hannah. They were strategically placed, almost artfully arranged, yet undeniably, on her lawn. Mildred's perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed. A vein throbbed in her temple. The gnome war had begun. The initial gnome deployment on Mildred's lawn was just the opening salvo. Over the next few days, the invasion escalated subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. One morning, Fisherman Finn appeared by Mildred's bird bath, diligently casting his tiny fishing rod into the empty ceramic basin. The next day, Gardener Gary was discovered kneeling amongst her prize-winning roses, wielding a miniature trowel and a disturbingly cheerful grin. Then came Sleepy Simon, found napping peacefully under her meticulously pruned azalea bush. Each gnome was carefully chosen, strategically placed, and deployed under the cover of darkness like miniature ceramic commandos infiltrating enemy territory. I took precautions, of course. Disguises, a baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses at night, perhaps overkill, but better safe than sorry, stealthy movements, and a meticulous avoidance of Mildred's security cameras, which naturally she had installed pointed directly at my yard after the first friendly reminder. It was becoming a nightly ritual, a clandestine gnome placing operation that was both exhilarating and slightly absurd. The reactions were, predictably, priceless. At first, Mildred seemed to dismiss the gnomes as some sort of bizarre prank, a fleeting annoyance. She would simply remove them, tossing them unceremoniously onto my lawn, sometimes with a muttered curse or a venomous glare in my direction. But the gnomes kept coming, multiplying like ceramic rabbits, appearing faster than she could remove them. Her initial annoyance morphed into confusion, then into outright rage. I witnessed her, through my strategically positioned binoculars, purely for gnome monitoring purposes, of course, stomping around her lawn, red-faced and sputtering, brandishing a garden rake like a weapon against the silent, grinning invaders. She started patrolling her yard at night, flashlight in hand, a suburban sentry guarding against gnome incursions. It was almost comical. Almost. The HOA predictably became involved again. Another friendly reminder, this time on a shade of crimson so intense it practically vibrated off the paper. "Cease and desist," it screamed in bold, underlined letters. "Your ongoing harassment of a fellow resident and blatant disregard for HOA regulations will not be tolerated. The placement of lawn ornaments on a neighbor's property is considered trespassing and is a violation of Willow Creek bylaws, city ordinances, and common decency." Common decency? From Mildred Macmillan. The irony was thicker than her perfectly manicured hedges. The cease and desist letter demanded the immediate removal of all gnomes from Mildred's property and threatened, this time, not just fines, but actual legal action, including a restraining order. A restraining order against gnomes. The absurdity was reaching epic proportions. But again, beneath the humor, I sensed a real escalation, a genuine threat. Mildred was not backing down, and neither, it seemed, was I. The gnome invasion intensified. Subtlety was no longer the primary tactic. Now it was about overwhelming force, a ceramic blitzkrieg. Instead of placing 1 or 2 gnomes each night, I started deploying entire squads, gnome platoons, gnome battalions. The Gnome Guard, a regiment of stern-faced, helmeted gnomes, took up positions along her driveway. The Garden Gnome Brigade, a colorful contingent of gardening gnomes, swarmed her flower beds. The Party Gnomes, a raucous group of gnomes wielding miniature musical instruments, staged a silent concert on her porch. Mildred's lawn was no longer Mildred's lawn. It was Gnome Land, a ceramic kingdom, a testament to the power of whimsical rebellion. Her prize-winning petunias were now obscured by a phalanx of gnomes. Her meticulously manicured lawn was dotted with ceramic sentinels. Her sterile suburban paradise had been transformed into a gnome-infested wonderland. The neighbors, initially amused, were now starting to take sides. Some, emboldened by my gnome rebellion, started adding their own gnomes to their yards, a silent show of solidarity, a subtle middle finger to Mildred and the HOA. Others, more cautious, whispered disapprovingly, worried about property values and community aesthetics. Willow Creek was no longer a picture of suburban harmony. It was a battleground, a gnome-divided community teetering on the brink of ceramic civil war. The local news even picked up the story. "Gnome warfare erupts in Willow Creek subdivision," blared the headline of the online article, accompanied by blurry photos of Mildred's gnome-infested lawn. The story went viral, shared and commented on across social media, turning our quiet suburban street into a national laughingstock. Mildred, predictably, was not amused. The next confrontation was inevitable. It happened in broad daylight, a suburban showdown witnessed by half the neighborhood. I was tending my own gnome-filled lawn, adding General Gnome, a gnome in a miniature military uniform, to the ranks, when Mildred stormed across the street, her face a mask of fury, brandishing a large plastic garbage bag. "Pruitt!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "This has gone far enough. I am putting an end to this gnome infestation right now." She lunged towards her lawn, garbage bag outstretched, intent on a gnome massacre. "Mildred, stop!" I yelled, rushing towards her, gnome trowel still in hand. "You can't just bag them." "Oh, I can, and I will," she snarled, snatching up Fisherman Finn and shoving him unceremoniously into the garbage bag. "These abominations are going where they belong, in the trash." The neighbors watched, transfixed, as Mildred, fueled by righteous rage, began her gnome-collecting rampage. Gnomes flew into the garbage bag: Happy Hannah, Grumpy Gus, Professor Gnome, all victims of Mildred's suburban purge. I tried to intervene to reason with her, but she was beyond reason, a woman possessed by gnome-induced fury. "Mildred, please, they're just gnomes," I pleaded, grabbing her arm as she reached for General Gnome. "They are a menace," she screeched, wrenching her arm free. "A blight on this community. And you, Arthur Pruitt, you are responsible for this ceramic terrorism." Ceramic terrorism. I almost laughed. Almost. The confrontation escalated. Voices were raised. Accusations were hurled. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the suburban spectacle. The gnome war had spilled out into the open, a public battle for the soul of Willow Creek, fought with ceramic soldiers and pastel pink pronouncements. And then, just when it seemed things couldn't get any more ridiculous, Lily arrived. Lily, my niece, the original gnome giver, arrived unexpectedly, bursting out of a taxi, beaming, excited to visit her gnome-loving uncle. She took one look at the scene unfolding in Mildred's front yard. Mildred, red-faced and furious, brandishing a garbage bag full of gnomes, me equally flustered, trying to reason with her, and the assembled neighbors gawking and whispering, and her smile faltered. "Uncle Arthur?" she asked, her voice small, confused. What's happening?" Mildred, sensing an audience, seized the opportunity. "This man," she declared, pointing a dramatic finger at me, "is a menace. He has infested my property with these ridiculous gnomes. He is harassing me, and he is devaluing our community." Lily looked from Mildred to me, her eyes wide with bewilderment. "But the gnomes are cute," she said softly, looking at the discarded gnomes overflowing from Mildred's garbage bag. "I gave Uncle Arthur Fred, and Wilbur, and Esmeralda." Her voice trailed off, her lower lip trembling. The air went out of Mildred's tirade like a punctured balloon. The righteous fury seemed to deflate, replaced by a flicker of something. Confusion? Embarrassment? Maybe even a sliver of guilt? She looked at Lily, then at the garbage bag full of gnomes, then back at Lily's crestfallen face. "Well," Mildred stammered, her voice suddenly less strident, more uncertain. "Well, they are against HOA regulations. Excessive lawn ornamentation." Her voice trailed off, the familiar bureaucratic jargon sounding hollow and unconvincing, even to her own ears. Lily took a step towards Mildred, her small face earnest, pleading. "But they make people smile," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Everyone smiles when they see the gnomes. They're happy." A long silence descended upon Willow Creek. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Mildred stared at Lily, then at the gnomes, then back at Lily. The anger seemed to drain from her face, replaced by a weariness, a kind of deflated resignation. The gnome war, it seemed, had reached an unexpected stalemate, not with a bang, but with the innocent words of a child. Mildred slowly lowered the garbage bag, the gnomes clanking softly inside. She looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Not anger, not triumph, but something else. Weariness, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, a hint of understanding. "Fine," she said, her voice barely audible. "Fine. Keep your gnomes." She turned abruptly, garbage bag still in hand, and retreated back to her house. Her shoulders slumped, her suburban crusade seemingly deflated. The neighbors dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves, the gnome war seemingly over, not with a decisive victory, but with a quiet, almost anticlimactic surrender. Lily rushed to me, hugging me tightly, her earlier confusion replaced by a relieved smile. "You won, Uncle Arthur," she whispered. "You won the gnome war." I knelt down, hugging her back, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a surprising pang of something akin to sympathy for Mildred. Had I really won, or had we both lost something in this absurd ceramic-fueled conflict? The gnome army remained, of course. They still populated my lawn, and surprisingly they remained on Mildred's lawn too. She never put them back, but she never removed them either. They stood there, silent, ceramic witnesses to the suburban skirmish that had briefly turned Willow Creek into a gnome-infested battleground. Life in Willow Creek slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though things were subtly different. The neighbors who had secretly admired my gnome rebellion now displayed their own gnomes, openly, proudly. Willow Creek, once a bastion of suburban conformity, was now, if not exactly gnome-friendly, at least gnome-tolerant. The HOA bylaws remained unchanged, but their enforcement seemed less zealous, less Mildred-esque. Mildred herself became something of a recluse. She still tended her lawn, still maintained her pristine hedges, but she was quieter, less assertive. She no longer sent out friendly reminders. She no longer patrolled her yard at night. She became, in a way, just another resident of Willow Creek. No longer the self-appointed arbiter of suburban taste. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was watering my gnomes when I saw Mildred emerge from her house, carrying a small, carefully wrapped package. She walked hesitantly towards my yard, stopping at the edge of my property line, her expression unreadable. "Arthur," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I wanted to apologize." I straightened up, gnome watering can in hand, surprised. "Apologize?" "Yes," she said, her gaze fixed on the package in her hands. For overreacting. About the gnomes. It was silly. It got out of hand. She held out the package. And Lily, she was right. They do make people smile. She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "Even me. Sometimes." I took the package. It was light, wrapped in plain brown paper. "What's this?" It's a peace offering," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile flickering across her lips. I found it in the attic. Thought you might appreciate it." I unwrapped the package. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a gnome. Not just any gnome. It was an old gnome, weathered and chipped, with a kind, gentle face and a slightly crooked hat. It was different from my army of brightly colored, mass-produced gnomes. This gnome had character, history, soul. This is beautiful, Mildred, I said, genuinely touched. Where did you get it? It was my grandmother's, she said softly. She loved gnomes, kept them all over her garden. Her voice trailed off, a hint of sadness in her eyes. She said they brought good luck and happiness. I looked at the old gnome, then at Mildred, really looked at her, not as the HOA Karen, not as the suburban tyrant, but as a person, a woman who beneath the layers of rules and regulations, the perfectly manicured facade was perhaps just lonely, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit saddened. Thank you, Mildred, I said, holding out my hand. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and shook it, a tentative, almost fragile gesture of truce. He'll be very welcome in the gnome army. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, the first I'd ever seen on her face. I think, she said softly, he'll be the general. And so the gnome war ended, not with a victory or a defeat, but with a peace offering, a shared smile, and a single, weathered gnome. A reminder that even in the most regulated, most conformist corners of suburbia, there is always room for a little bit of whimsy, a little bit of rebellion, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of gnome-induced happiness.